Hello, everyone. I'm so happy to be here and to share my research with you. As Eve mentioned, I started researching the work of Ismar David about 2 years ago, and I couldn't stop. I guess this is a lethal combination between my personal frustration with Hebrew type as a designer and my obsession to know more and more as a researcher. So I'd like to first introduce you to Ismar David. He was born in 1910 in Germany to a Jewish family. And in 1928, he studies in Berlin at the Arts and Crafts School. In 1932, he wins a book design competition for the Jewish National Fund. And this is a design competition for the cover of their books that they're producing for their donors. And he takes this opportunity to travel to Jerusalem and supervise the printing of his work. And he stays in Jerusalem for the following 2 decades. And these are rough times in Jerusalem. The number of Jewish immigrants is increasing, the resources are limited, and with the volatile political situation, the living conditions are challenging. Or as one of David's friends puts it very well in a letter to him, saying, "It's very interesting to witness the birth of a state, but not recommended." So he establishes his design studio in Jerusalem, and he gets a lot of commissions from the temporary government. I'm showing you a little bit of his work. These are documents for the Ministry of Finance, symbols for communications, coins, banknotes, stamps, all those things that had to be created from scratch for a new state. And of course, he does commercial work also, and this is mostly done with lettering, Hebrew and German, or Hebrew and English. And this is where he first encounters the shortage with Hebrew typefaces. And he realizes when it comes to setting longer amounts of text, the resources are quite slim. Now, before we dive into the typeface itself, I want to tell you that Ismar David was not only a typeface designer. He was a prolific calligrapher, illustrator, book designer, architect, and educator, and he did a lot of things during his very long career. The only thing he didn't do was to document his work process. So this is me at the Carey Graphic Collection, digging in, this extensive archive of wonderful work, boxes filled with sketches. Most of them, if not all of them, have no dates, no titles, and no annotations. So I've been finding myself, putting my detective hat on and trying to kind of make sense of a lot of things. And also, there are a few research articles available for this subject, but not many. And again, David didn't document his work. We do have some correspondence with his reflection of his work. So what I've been trying to do was to kind of retrace his work process and see what we can learn from that. I want to share with you now what I was able to conclude and what I was able to fit in 20 minutes, because of course there is so much more. This was the starting point for me, and this is the original ink drawing of the comprehensive typeface family. And personally, for me, as a designer that works with the Hebrew script and type, this was mind-blowing. I never realized that this thing could actually exist in Hebrew. This is the regular style with 3 weights, the italic style, 3 weights, and the monolinear one, which is the equivalent of the sans serif Latin in 3 weights. So in 1972, Israel Seufer writes a letter to David and asks him for detail about the David Hebrew family. And David writes back, "My dream was to enable every printer in the country to produce well-planned, well-organized printing for books and commerce, aesthetically comparable to printing with Roman type." Now, this is where things get complicated, right? How do you create this comparability between 2 scripts that are so different? So very briefly about the Hebrew type and its development, The modern Hebrew letter was developed from the Aramaic or Assyrian alphabet around 560 BCE. It was the language of the Israelite and the Judean people for over 1,300 years. When around 200 BCE, it died as a spoken language and was restricted to religious use. It was only reintroduced as a spoken language around the 1880s. So we have this long period of time that the Hebrew was only read and copied, and even the scribes that were authorized to copy the letters and to write religious texts couldn't introduce any changes to the letter forms themselves because they were considered holy. So even at the cost of poor readability, they would copy the same shapes. And you can only imagine the shift between the written form to movable type. So punch cutters didn't have a clear model to follow. Most of them did not speak the language, were not familiar with the script, and again, they kept copying those shapes that became fixed. Now, during the 15th century, we did have some prosperity, but again, it didn't last long. The Jewish people suffered persecution, and they were often forced to flee and relocate their presses, and again, that prevented the continuous natural development that is needed for the refinement of type. That also means that the concept of typeface families did not develop for the Hebrew type as it did for the Latin type. So what would typesetters of Hebrew do? Well, they practically did whatever they can and used whatever they had. I'm showing you an example of an almanac printed in Minsk in 1905. And we can see here a combination of different typefaces, different sizes, different weights, increased letter space in specific words, and underlining. So this is what they were doing to create word differentiation without having a typeface family. And what was available for David around that time in Jerusalem for setting longer amounts of text were mostly these two typefaces. And both of them were made in Europe and were very much influenced by the fashions of that time. If we take a closer look at the letter resh, we can see that at the top example, it's typeface. The style of it is called resh. It doesn't have a proper name. And we can see how high the contrast is, and this is quite risky for the Hebrew script because its stress is horizontal. And this causes the letter to feel very unstable. On top of that, the thin line, the leg of the letter, sometimes it was so thin that it wouldn't print, and then the letter would disappear completely. The example at the bottom is the Frank Rule typeface that was produced in 1910 and has introduced a great improvement. But still, so we see the contrast is much lower, but it is still very decorative for book typesetting, and it would create a very dark texture on the page. And here's where David's revolutionary ideas come to play. He writes in a draft for a speech he gave to the typophiles in 1973. When I decided to venture into type design of Hebrew characters, it was clear to me that these designs would have to be much closer to classic Oriental Hebrew than the typefaces that had developed in Europe. What I set out to do was bring basic forms closer to true Old Semitic forms to define their proportions in a way that would create a more even texture. And I think that by that time, David is so knowledgeable with the Latin scripts. He knows about writing styles and their development inside out. And because of that, I think he starts his design process with research. He studies the origin of the Hebrew letter and bases the complete family on his findings. And subsequently, he is able to create new and improved letter forms. It's worth mentioning that around that time, in Israel were a series of major archaeological findings that were related to Hebrew writing, and it is more than likely that David was familiar with them. So, for example, I'm showing you a segment from the Dead Sea Scrolls, and if we can zoom in just on one word that I can read, because the script hasn't changed since then, Only from this brief overview, I think you can sense these strong correlations in the shapes of the letters. And I want to dig deeper and highlight the innovative features that David introduces by comparing it to the Frank Rule typeface, which was extremely popular at the time that it was published and still is today. So the first thing that we're seeing is, again, a much lower contrast that makes the letter way more stable. And as Professor Addistern pointed out in his research, we can look at the shape of the in-strokes and see this triangular shape that feels like it was created by a reed pen. So very much follows the writing tools and the writing way of the original Hebrew. Another brilliant feature is this way that David is incorporating some variation to the letter shapes. So you can see at the top example, the in-stroke is actually flaring just a little bit at the top of the letter. So instead of using exactly the same shape for all the in-strokes, as you can see at the Frank Rule, he's tracing again the direction and the way the Hebrew is written to introduce another shape into the alphabet, to the type. Another crucial thing that we have in the Hebrew scripts are groups or couples of letters that are extremely similar to one another. And I've highlighted the dangerous areas for you to see how David is making sure to treat them very, very differently. And of course, the smaller size the type is, the easier it is to read when these differences are there. And he does these features across all the typeface family, across all styles and all weights. Let's move into the italic style now. I was looking for more ways of differentiation in Hebrew that were available after 1910 around Jerusalem. I looked into the Big Red, so the red linotype specimen book from the 20s, and there I found this typeface who's called Hebrew number 3. Again, nameless typefaces. It is very similar to Frank Rule's Miriam typeface from around that time. And you can see here some kind of almost monolinear style that has the upright version and the slanted version. But when I looked for example of this type being used, I was able to see it in newspapers from 1935, for example, but the slanted style was paired with the merubah style. So even though the two styles existed, typesetters would still combine them with different typefaces. So again, what I think David did was go back and understand the true meaning of a true italic. And he looks at cursive styles in Hebrew. We have two of these styles, the semi-cursive and the informal cursive. The semi-cursive is a proper secondary style. It was used mostly for religious commentary. So as you can see in this example, the main text is in the formal, the merubah style, and the commentary is set around it in this semi-cursive or Rashi style. And I believe that this is the transformation that created this true Hebrew italic. So we have the regular bet on the left side, the reference from the semi-script Hebrew in the middle, and the way it is introduced into the italic letter. Another reference, the informal cursive, again, is Hebrew fast writing. So you can see the loops that are created on the writing surface. And here is how I think this process went, very delicately and accurately introducing these loops into this style. And I'm sure you've been wondering about the direction of the slant for Hebrew. So I was so happy to find this sketch that shows that David tried both direction of the slant, so leaning to the right or leaning to the left, and eventually he went with the left direction, which follows the reading direction of the Hebrew. The monolinear style shows very strong correlation to Hebrew inscriptions and mosaics. And if we just pull out these letters and show them next to that style, I think you can see how strong this relationship is. And if we put them next to the Hebrew number 3, I think you can really sense how the two typefaces came from completely different places. So finally, in 1954, after about 15 years of work, the David Hebrew typeface is being produced with Intertype Corporation in New York. Only the regular style and the italic style in 2 sizes. It is extremely popular in Israel. Typesetters and printers love it. It is very modern. It solves a lot of readability problems, and it really reflects the essence and the spirit of the time back in Israel. And it's mostly used for literature and poetry. And while the regular style is very successful, the italic style is completely rejected. We have correspondence saying typesetters and printers don't want any more of the italic types. Instead, they want bolder types and more sizes. We have to make a jump and fast forward into 1984, where Ismar David is adapting his typeface for photo typesetting with Stempel. He adds the vowel marks, and this would be the last original David Hebrew version that was available for the market for a very long time. And around that time, the floodgates are opened, and the market is saturated with bastardized, deformed versions of David Hebrew. And in the following years, this typeface becomes less and less popular, and all these fake Davids that were hanging around, again, are less and less seen in publications. What might have contributed to that was the fact that in the late 90s, Microsoft Word shipped with a default font called David Gutman. And this is how it looked like. So the original David Hebrew is at the top, and the Gutman version is at the bottom. And with very little resemblance to the original design, the regular style became predominantly used in the word processing software by users who are not professional typographers. And if that's not enough, this version became the official typeface for Israeli bureaucracy correspondence. So a very strong shift from the literature and the poetry of the 60s. The original outlines were long gone, and the name of this typeface became synonymous with amateur typesetting, and typographer would avoid using it. So it disappeared for a while. But in 2012, Monotype released the David Chadash. Chadash means new in Hebrew. This typeface was produced through an exclusive license with Ismar David's estate. And Helen Branshaft, who worked closely with David for many years, restored and redrew the typeface family with great accuracy and sensitivity. So for the first time, the complete family was available. In 2016, that same version of the regular with 3 weights was released with the Google Libre font, so now the regular style is available for free. However, the fact that everything is out there does not necessarily mean it is being used. And I've been looking around for more contemporary Hebrew publications to see what typesetters are doing these days. And what I've found was mostly the same typographic acrobatics that typesetters would have to do in the early 1900s. So for emphasizing or differentiating, we have different typefaces in bolder weights, increased letter spacing, and underlining. But I want to finish on a positive note. There was a book waiting for me in Reading University at the reading room, and all of it was set with the David Hebrew typeface family. So the headlines would be regular bold, the main text would be the regular, and all the words that had to be differentiated would use the true italic. And that was a real treat for me, and I feel this is very encouraging. So I hope this inspires you as much as it inspired me, but more importantly, I hope that I was able to show here that it is possible, with a lot of research and a lot of insight, to overcome the typographic constraints of Hebrew type. Thank you.